When we think of medieval castles, images of grandeur, loyal knights, and majestic feasts often come to mind. But the reality of living in one of these fortresses was far from glamorous. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort. Their cold, damp stone walls offered little protection from the elements, and the lack of proper insulation made winters particularly harsh. Hygiene was another challenge, with primitive sanitation systems leading to unpleasant living conditions. Beyond physical discomfort, life in a castle was also filled with constant threats, from sieges and invasions to internal power struggles. Join us as we uncover the harsh truths about everyday life within these historic structures, exploring the challenges faced by the people who called them home and the unexpected struggles that came with life behind the castle walls. 1. Romanticized visits reality. The romanticized view of medieval castles often paints them as grand, elegant fortresses where royalty and noble families lived in luxury and comfort. Stories and films frequently emphasize sprawling banquets, opulent decorations, and serene landscapes surrounding these majestic fortifications. However, the reality of living in a medieval castle was far from this idealized image. Life in a castle was characterized by discomfort, practicality, and survival against the challenges of medieval life. One of the most unglamorous aspects of castle life was the lack of proper sanitation. Castles, even those with advanced designs, often featured rudimentary waste disposal systems, such as garderobes or cesspits, which were prone to contamination and unpleasant odors. Hygiene was another major challenge, as bathing was infrequent and castles lacked proper plumbing or access to clean water. Residents of castles endured cold, drafty interiors due to the stone construction, which, while sturdy and resistant to attack, retained little heat. Heating relied on large fireplaces, which were inefficient for warming the vast spaces of the castle, particularly in the winter months. Additionally, the romantic image of castle residents enjoying endless feasts diverges from the dietary realities of the time. While nobles did consume a variety of meats and wines, their diets were often unbalanced and lacked fresh fruits and vegetables, which were less accessible in colder climates. Food preservation methods like salting and smoking sometimes left meals less than appetizing. Peasants and servants residing in the castle had even fewer culinary luxuries, making do with simple fare like bread, porridge, and occasionally small servings of meat. Beyond the physical discomforts, life in a castle also meant constant preparedness for conflict. Castles were built for defense above all else, and their purpose as strongholds necessitated an ongoing sense of caution. Siege warfare was a frequent threat, and castle inhabitants often endured long periods of isolation and limited supplies while under siege. The romanticized peace and tranquility of castle life didn't account for the harsh reality of living under constant threat from enemy forces or dealing with the outbreak of diseases within the castle walls due to overcrowding. 2. The purpose and construction of castles. The medieval castle's primary function was strategic defense and territorial control. These structures served as military fortresses, administrative centers, and symbols of the feudal lord's power over the land. Castles were not designed for comfort, but rather for practicality and survival against both human and environmental threats. Their locations were often carefully chosen based on geographic advantages, such as hilltops, river crossings, or forested areas, which made them easier to defend and harder to attack. The construction of a castle was a monumental task requiring immense resources, skilled labor, and careful planning. Early castles, such as motte and bailey structures, were relatively simple and made of wood. They consisted of an earthen mound, the motte, topped by a wooden keep and surrounded by a protective courtyard, the bailey. While these structures were quick to build, their vulnerability to fire and decay led to the adoption of stone as a primary building material in later centuries. Stone castles represented a significant advancement in medieval military architecture. These fortresses featured thick walls, high towers, and deep moats to deter enemy attacks. The construction process, however, was labor-intensive and often spanned decades. Quarrying and transporting large blocks of stone required a well-organized workforce, including architects, masons, and laborers. The lords who commissioned these castles needed significant financial resources to sustain the labor force and acquire the necessary materials. Despite their defensive advantages, stone castles were not invincible. Advancements in siege warfare, such as trebuchets, battering rams, and undermining, presented new challenges to castle defenses. As a result, medieval architects continued to innovate, experimenting with features like concentric walls, arrow slits, and murder holes to repel attackers. Features such as drawbridges and portcullises added another layer of protection for entry points, making access to the interior of the castle highly challenging for invaders. Internally, castles were divided into functional spaces, including great halls for gatherings, kitchens for food preparation, and separate chambers for the lord and their family. While these areas served their purpose, the lack of insulation and rudimentary design made castle interiors cold and unwelcoming, especially in winter. Servants and soldiers lived in far less favorable conditions, often sleeping in shared quarters with little privacy or comfort. 3. Life inside castles. Living in a medieval castle might sound romantic at first glance, with visions of grand halls, towering stone walls, and beautiful courtyards. However, the reality for those inside was often far less glamorous. These fortresses, while remarkable feats of engineering, were designed primarily for defense, not for comfort. Daily life within the castle was tough, and the challenges of living in such an environment were felt by everyone, from monarchs to servants. For the nobility, there was an air of sophistication, but even they dealt with cold, damp chambers and inadequate ventilation. Castles were constructed of thick stone walls that retained the chill in winter and created an uncomfortable coolness even in warm weather. Fires were essential for heating, yet the smoke from large hearths often filled the hallways, as proper chimneys were not common in earlier designs. Typically, only the great hall and the private quarters of the lord and lady had the privilege of warmth, provided by large hearths. Sanitation within castles was primitive at best. Privies, or garderobes, were small protruding chambers often built into the outer walls, allowing waste to drop into foul-smelling cesspits below. Gong farmers were tasked with cleaning these cesspits, a job that was both hazardous and deeply unpleasant. Even nobles struggled with personal hygiene, as concepts of modern sanitation and bathing were not the norm. Water supplies were limited, especially in times of siege, which made cleanliness a luxury many could not afford. The great halls, while central to castle life, were not a bastion of comfort either. Used for feasts, gatherings, and court sessions, they were often noisy, crowded places. This was where most of the retainers and servants ate and slept, with little regard for privacy. Bedding was sparse, typically comprising straw-filled mattresses that were prone to lice and infestation. Even the more comfortable chambers of the lord and lady were not entirely free of these inconveniences. Food, while plentiful in wealthier castles, lacked the variety and freshness we would expect today. Kitchens were a bustling center of activity, producing large quantities of meals daily. Meals often consisted of preserved meats, heavy bread, and thick stews, with spices used sparingly for flavor. While grand banquets might feature roasted game and exotic imports like sugar, these luxuries were rare. Meat and ale were staples, but fresh fruits and vegetables could be scarce, particularly in winter or during prolonged sieges. The lives of the servants and laborers within the castle were even harsher. These individuals not only endured the physical toil of maintaining the castle, but also lived in cramped, unsanitary quarters. Workdays were long, starting before dawn and stretching into the evening. From sunrise to sunset, cooks prepared food, blacksmiths repaired armor and tools, and stable hands tended the horses. Messengers traveled tirelessly, conveying letters and orders, while household servants ensured that life within the castle continued despite the hardships. For children growing up in castles, life was structured by responsibilities and training. Noble children had the privilege of education, learning manners, horsemanship, and even rudimentary literacy. However, the children of servants spent their days helping with chores, with little opportunity for play. There was a strict hierarchy within the castle, and this was reflected in the day-to-day experiences of its youngest inhabitants. 4. Castles as a self-sustaining community. Despite the hardships of life in a medieval castle, these fortresses were marvels of self-sufficiency. Castles needed to function as isolated hubs that could withstand prolonged sieges or natural disasters. To do so, they employed a remarkable level of organization, relying on a diverse workforce and well-planned systems to sustain their inhabitants. A medieval castle operated like a small, self-contained village. Within its walls, nearly every profession required for survival could be found. Farmers and laborers produced food outside the castle walls, but inside it was processed, cooked, and stored. Bakers worked tirelessly to produce bread, a dietary staple, while brewers prepared ale, often safer to drink than water due to poor sanitation practices. Mills for grinding flour were located either within the castle or nearby, ensuring a constant supply. The courtyard bustled with activity. Blacksmiths and armorers worked day and night, crafting and repairing essential tools, weapons, and armor. Their work was vital, particularly in times of conflict. Stables housed horses, which required constant care from stable hands, while messengers delivered orders across the region. Each role within the castle was intricately connected, creating a web of interdependence. Castles also had designated storage areas, including granaries, smokehouses, and wine cellars, which allowed them to stockpile supplies. This preparation was especially important in times of war, as a well-stocked castle could endure sieges lasting months or even years. Hunting in the surrounding forests and fishing in nearby streams supplemented the stored food supply, providing fresh meat and fish when needed. Water was a critical resource and posed one of the greatest challenges for self-sustainability. Many castles were built near natural water sources such as rivers or springs to ensure access. Some fortresses even included wells within their walls, a crucial feature during sieges. However, maintaining a clean water supply was no easy task, especially when it was shared by hundreds of people and livestock. The religious and spiritual needs of the inhabitants were typically met within the castle itself. Chapels were a common feature, with priests or monks often residing within the castle to conduct daily prayers, weddings, and burials. Religion played a central role in medieval life, and the presence of a chapel emphasized the importance of faith within the castle community. Despite their efforts to be self-sustaining, castles were not impervious to scarcity and hardship. Extended sieges could lead to dwindling supplies, forcing inhabitants to ration food and water. Diseases, exacerbated by poor sanitation and overcrowding, could spread rapidly. Rats and other pests were common, further threatening food stores and contributing to unsanitary living conditions. 5. War and sieges. Life in medieval castles was grim during times of war and sieges. These fortresses, though designed for protection, often became temporary prisons when an enemy decided to lay siege. A siege could last weeks, months, or even years, cutting off supplies and forcing those inside to survive on dwindling resources. Food shortages were a common occurrence, leading desperate inhabitants to eat anything they could find, including rats, dogs, or even leather from their own shoes. Disease spread rapidly in the cramped and unsanitary conditions of a castle under siege, with contaminated water and waste disposal creating a breeding ground for illnesses like dysentery. The defenders of a castle had to rely heavily on their preparation and strategic defenses, such as battlements, moats, and drawbridges, to fend off attackers. Archers lined the walls, shooting arrows from protective loopholes, while boiling oil or heavy stones were often dropped onto enemies attempting to scale the walls. However, as siege technology advanced, attackers gained the upper hand with battering rams, siege towers, and eventually gunpowder-powered cannons. These developments made once impenetrable castles vulnerable, intensifying the stress and fear for those within. For many, surviving a siege wasn't only about physical endurance, but also mental perseverance under the looming threat of starvation, assault, or capture. 6. Secrets and mysteries of castles. Medieval castles were more than just strongholds of defense. They held an air of intrigue, filled with secrets and mysteries designed to provide both tactical advantages and an element of surprise. Hidden passages and secret tunnels were a staple of castle design, often used for covert escapes or safely moving supplies during a siege. These clandestine pathways served not only as lifelines but also as traps for unwelcome intruders who might stumble into the unknown, becoming lost or ambushed. A notable example is found in Edinburgh Castle, which features an intricate underground system of escape routes that were employed during times of war. Espionage and intelligence were equally essential in the life of a medieval castle. Some walls were built hollow or fitted with disguised holes, allowing the inhabitants to listen in on private conversations, a primitive but effective form of eavesdropping. This strategic innovation reinforced the idea that no space in the castle was truly private, maintaining control and vigilance over all parties within its walls. The darker side of castle life can be seen in the notorious dungeons hidden deep underground. While some dungeons merely served as prisons, others became infamous as centers for torture and punishment. For instance, Nuremberg Castle housed a dungeon equipped with various tools of torment, intended not only to extract information but also to intimidate anyone who dared oppose the ruling power. These foreboding spaces were often located beneath thick layers of stone, serving as a grim reminder of the harsh realities of law enforcement and authority during medieval times. Even beyond warfare and punishment, many castles were cloaked in local folklore and eerie legends, such as ghostly sightings and cursed chambers. For all the grandeur of their design, castles remained cold and shadowy places where mystery thrived. The low light of flickering torches and the echo of footsteps along endless stone corridors made castles feel like a world apart, a place where nothing was quite as it seemed. While medieval castles inspire images of gallant knights and royalty, life within their walls was often grim, fraught with secrecy, danger, and the constant need to stay one step ahead of an ever-looming threat. These challenges, both practical and mysterious, reveal the stark reality that castle life was far more harrowing than the romantic myths suggest. 7. Nighttime in castles. Nighttime in medieval castles was far from the tranquil and peaceful scene many might imagine. Instead, it was a time of heightened vulnerability and constant vigilance due to the numerous dangers lurking in the shadows. Castles, illuminated primarily by candles, torches, and hearth fires, were at perpetual risk of devastating fires. The flames from these rudimentary light sources lacked stability and control, and in the stone and wood interiors of castles, a single accidental spark could spell disaster. Fire safety meant extinguishing most flames by nightfall, leaving residents to rely on faint moonlight or memory to traverse the dimly lit halls. This scarcity of light amplified not only the physical hazards, but also the anxieties of those who lived within the castle walls. Navigating these sprawling structures in the dark could be treacherous. It wasn't uncommon for residents to trip over uneven stones, stumble on steep stairs, or become completely disoriented in the maze-like design. Additionally, the darkness brought an aura of paranoia and danger that bred fear of the unknown. Folklore and superstition added to the unease, as threats of supernatural entities like ghosts and spirits loomed heavily over the imagination of medieval tenants. The quiet of the night was also interrupted by the relentless presence of potential outside threats. Guards would remain stationed, patrolling the perimeter, watching towers, and listening for any sound that might signify an attack. To protect against nocturnal infiltrators, the castle gates were often secured with heavy reinforcements, and commoners were banned from roaming near the stronghold after dark to avoid suspicion of espionage. Family feuds, rivalries among noble families, and foreign invaders meant that every night passed under the shadow of insecurity. Even within the castle itself, threats could arise as treachery and distrust were not uncommon among the residents and their allies. The lack of nighttime safety measures and the high prevalence of conspiracies combined to create a nighttime castle experience that was not only physically hazardous but also intensely psychologically taxing. Residents had to adapt to these conditions, often employing guards or loyal retainers to stand watch, carefully rationing candles, and maintaining a level of preparedness and suspicion that would ensure survival. 8. Betrayals and conspiracies. Living in a medieval castle also meant constantly navigating a world of stepped-up political intrigue, betrayals, and conspiracies. The medieval era was characterized by power struggles and shifting alliances, and the castle, as a seat of power and control, was at the very center of these dangerous games. Those within its walls were frequently embroiled in plots, whether as perpetrators or as potential victims. This climate of mistrust poisoned relationships, leading nobles to treat even their closest allies with suspicion. One infamous example of medieval betrayal occurred in 1407 with the assassination of John the Fearless, Duke of Burgundy. During what was meant to be a peaceful meeting in Paris to resolve a political dispute, John was killed by supporters of his rival. Such incidents were not uncommon, as treaties and truces often disguised ulterior motives. To avoid becoming victims of such schemes, castle-dwelling nobles frequently plotted their own measures for securing power, leading to a cycle of duplicity that permeated medieval politics. Poisonings, too, became a familiar tool for those seeking to eliminate rivals quietly and effectively. Food and drink were often targeted, requiring nobles to maintain food tasters or employ other safeguards against being poisoned at their own feasts. Such dangers could emerge from seemingly benign courtiers, visiting dignitaries, or even members of one's household. This constant threat extended beyond meals. Loyalists and spies routinely operated within the courts, gathering intelligence or sabotaging efforts under the guise of dutiful service. To guard against potential conspiracies and assassinations, nobles often took extraordinary measures. Secret chambers and passageways were constructed within castles to provide a means of escape or to ensure privacy from spying enemies. These architectural features could include hidden staircases, concealed alcoves, and even trapdoors, all designed to protect against nighttime attacks or to provide a tactical advantage in moments of betrayal. Nevertheless, no amount of secrecy or security could entirely eliminate the culture of paranoia that permeated medieval castles. Noble families were well aware that their power made them targets for aggression, and their dependence on alliances, which were often based on temporary convenience rather than trust, left them perpetually exposed to danger. The combination of external threats from rival factions and internal struggles with betrayal made castle life not only physically but emotionally grueling. For many, living in a medieval castle was less of a privilege than a precarious balancing act in a landscape fraught with danger. 9. Marriages and forbidden love. Life in a medieval castle was often influenced by strict societal structures, and one of the most personal aspects of life, marriage, was no exception. Marriages among the nobility were rarely based on love or personal choice. Instead, they were more about forging political alliances, securing wealth, and strengthening family power. Parents or guardians typically arranged these unions while the individuals involved had little to no say. Young girls, often as young as 12 or 14, would be married off to much older men, prioritizing strategic advantage over personal happiness. For those living in a castle, the confines of duty and expectation often made the idea of romantic love impossible. However, that didn't stop forbidden relationships from occurring. These secret liaisons could have dire consequences. Executions or public shaming awaited those who challenged the norms. Love outside marriage was deemed scandalous, and women, in particular, bore harsh punishments if caught. Adultery could result not only in personal disgrace but also in political repercussions for families, tarnishing their reputations. Knights and ladies were often subjects of courtly love, a literary and cultural phenomenon celebrated in medieval poetry and stories. Although presented as chivalrous, this idealized form of love rarely translated into real life. Instead, many such relationships were platonic or entirely fictional. The realities of castle life left little room for expressions of genuine affection, making the idea of love both complex and precariously dangerous. 10. Uncomfortable realities of castle life. Though castles are often romanticized in stories of knights and kings, they were far from the idyllic sanctuaries one might imagine. Hygiene was a significant challenge. Waste was disposed of in primitive ways, typically by dumping it into moats or nearby streams, contaminating water sources and spreading disease among residents. Moats may have served as lines of defense, but they quickly became cesspools that bred sickness. Poor sanitation affected everyone, from the lowest servant to the highest lord. Another unpleasant reality was the near-constant presence of lice and fleas. With limited access to baths, often heated on special occasions only, and rarely washed clothing, infestations were rampant. Even the wealthiest castle inhabitants suffered from these vermin, as barriers like wealth or status could not fend off hygiene issues. The damp, cold stone walls of castles offered another problem: mold. Living in dark and poorly ventilated corridors caused health ailments, particularly respiratory illnesses. Additionally, castles could be breeding grounds for epidemics. The close quarters, lack of proper waste disposal, and unsanitary conditions contributed to the rapid spread of diseases such as the Black Death. Crowded feasts, bustling servants, and confined living spaces meant that illnesses passed from one person to another with alarming speed. The communal nature of castle life, while essential for protection and cooperation, made residents vulnerable during times of plague. Beyond hygiene, the physical comfort of castle dwellers was also lacking. Castle interiors were designed primarily for defense, leaving them cold and drafty. Fireplaces provided limited warmth, and tapestries on walls served dual purposes: to display wealth and reduce the pervasive chill. However, even these measures were insufficient to make castle life remotely luxurious by today's standards. Living in a medieval castle may have held a certain allure for those enthralled by the tales of knights and nobles, but the truth was much harsher. The realities of poor hygiene, health risks, and limited comforts made castle life a daily struggle to endure, revealing that even the privileged were not spared from the challenges of medieval existence. In conclusion, while medieval castles stand today as enduring symbols of history, power, and romance, their reality was far less enchanting. Beneath the grandeur of towering walls and majestic feasts lay a life fraught with discomfort, danger, and hardship. Those who lived within these imposing structures faced harsh living conditions, unpredictable health consequences, and a lack of even basic modern amenities. The image of castles as bastions of medieval luxury is a far cry from the challenging day-to-day realities experienced by their inhabitants. Living in a medieval castle was not a fairy tale, but a testament to human resilience in the face of adversity.